There's a story about tardigrades that everyone on the internet seems to believe. You've probably heard it, maybe you've even repeated it. It goes like this. Tardigrades are indestructible microscopic animals that can survive anything. Boiling water, freezing temperatures, radiation, the vacuum of space. They're basically invincible. They can live in space without a suit. They're the toughest creatures on Earth, maybe in the entire universe, and if humanity ever goes extinct, tardigrades will inherit the planet. Here's the problem. Almost all of that is a lie. Not a complete lie, but a massive exaggeration built on misunderstandings, clickbait headlines, and people repeating things they never actually verified. The truth about tardigrades is way more interesting than the myth, and way more complicated. This is the real story of tardigrades in space, and it's time someone actually told it. Let's start with what tardigrades actually are. They're microscopic animals, about 0.5 millimeter long at most. Some species are even smaller, just 0.1 millimeters. You need a microscope to see them properly. 8 legs, chunky, segmented bodies, a face that looks like a tiny vacuum cleaner nozzle, surrounded by what can only be described as a nightmare mouth. That mouth is called a buccopharyngeal apparatus, and it's lined with stylets, tiny needle-like structures they use to pierce plant cells or other microscopic prey and suck out the contents. They look adorable under a microscope, like tiny gummy bears, until you see them feeding, and then they look like something from a horror movie. They live everywhere: soil, moss, leaf litter, ocean sediment, freshwater ponds, glaciers, hot springs. There are over 1,300 known species of tardigrades, and they've been around for at least 500 million years, possibly longer. They're ancient, they're everywhere, and yes, they're tough, but not in the way the internet claims. Here's where the myth starts. Tardigrades can enter a state called cryptobiosis, specifically a form called anhydrobiosis, life without water. When their environment dries out, tardigrades curl up into a little ball called a ton, expel almost all the water from their bodies, up to 97% of their total water content, shut down their metabolism to near zero, and wait. In this state, they're not really alive, they're not dead either. They're in suspended animation, existing in a kind of biological pause mode that can last for years, maybe decades. The longest confirmed survival in a ton state is about 30 years, though some researchers suspect they could last even longer under the right conditions. And while they're in this ton state, they can survive things that would obliterate most life on Earth. Extreme cold, down to near absolute zero. Extreme heat, up to 151 degrees Celsius for brief periods. Radiation doses that would turn a human into a puddle. Crushing pressure 6 times deeper than the Mariana Trench, even the vacuum of space. And that's where the internet loses its mind, because in 2007, researchers sent tardigrades into space. The mission was called FOTONM3, a European Space Agency experiment. They took 2 species of tardigrades, Rictursius, Coronifer and Milnesium tardigradum, dehydrated them into ton states, and placed them in small containers on the outside of a spacecraft. Fully exposed, no protection, no shielding, just tiny animals in suspended animation floating in the void. They were exposed to solar radiation, cosmic radiation, ultraviolet light, extreme temperature fluctuations, and hard vacuum. For 10 days, and when the spacecraft returned to Earth, the researchers rehydrated the tardigrades, and some of them survived. They started moving. Their legs began working again. They resumed feeding. They even reproduced. The headlines exploded. Tardigrades survive in space. Indestructible animals prove life can exist in the vacuum. Water bears are the toughest creatures in the universe. And the myth was born. But here's what those headlines didn't mention. Most of the tardigrades died, and not just some. Most. The survival rate for tardigrades exposed to full solar radiation and vacuum was around 12%. 1 in 8. The rest were killed, destroyed by radiation, desiccation, and the trauma of space exposure. And the ones that survived, they didn't just shrug it off and keep living. Many of them were damaged. Their reproductive rates dropped significantly. Some of the survivors produced far fewer offspring than normal tardigrades. Their movement was impaired. Their recovery time was longer. They survived, but they were hurt. This isn't invincibility. This is barely surviving an environment that kills almost everything. It's like saying humans can survive being struck by lightning because 90% of lightning strike victims survive. Technically true. Also, you definitely don't want to get struck by lightning, and yet the internet took that 12% survival rate and turned it into tardigrades can live in space. They can't. They can survive space temporarily while in a dormant state. That's not the same thing. Living implies metabolism, growth, reproduction. Tardigrades in space aren't living. They're enduring, and most of them don't even manage that. But the lie gets worse, because people started saying tardigrades can survive anything. Boiling water, freezing, crushing pressure, radiation levels that would liquefy a human. And again, there's a kernel of truth here. In the ton state, tardigrades have survived temperatures as low as -272 degrees Celsius, just 1 degree above absolute zero. They've survived temperatures as high as 151 degrees Celsius for a few minutes. They've survived pressures of 6,000 atmospheres, 6 times greater than the deepest ocean trench. They've survived radiation doses of 5,000 to 6,000 grays. A dose of 5 grays is lethal to humans. All true, all impressive, all documented in scientific studies. But here's the thing nobody mentions. They can only do this in the ton state, when they're dried out, when their metabolism is shut down, when they're essentially not alive. An active hydrated tardigrade, you can kill it with tap water that's too hot. You can kill it by stepping on it. You can kill it with a mild acid or base. You can kill it with salt water if the concentration is wrong. You can kill it with detergent. They're fragile when they're actually alive. The indestructible reputation only applies to the dormant state, and even then, it's not absolute. You can absolutely kill a tardigrade in tune form. Sustained heat above 151 degrees Celsius will destroy them. Certain chemicals can break down their protective proteins. Prolonged exposure to extreme radiation will eventually damage their DNA beyond repair. You just have to try harder than you would with an active tardigrade. But the internet doesn't care about nuance. The internet wants indestructible space bears. And so the myth grew. People started claiming tardigrades could survive on Mars, that they could colonize other planets, that they're Earth's backup plan in case we destroy ourselves, that they'll outlive everything, including cockroaches and humans. And researchers didn't help, because every time a new tardigrade study came out, the press release would lean into the indestructible angle to get media attention. Universities know that tardigrade survives extreme condition gets headlines. Tardigrade demonstrates context-dependent resilience through cryptobiotic adaptation does not. So they simplified. They exaggerated. They wrote press releases with headlines like "Tardigrades survive extreme condition," without mentioning the survival rate, without mentioning the damage, without mentioning that they were dormant the whole time, without mentioning that the conditions weren't even that extreme compared to what was claimed. And journalists, most of whom don't have biology backgrounds, would copy the press release almost verbatim. And the cycle continued. Now here's where it gets really frustrating. In 2019, an Israeli spacecraft called Bereshit crashed on the moon. It was supposed to be the first privately funded lunar landing. It failed. The spacecraft's engine malfunctioned, and it slammed into the lunar surface at several hundred meters per second. The impact was catastrophic. The spacecraft was destroyed. And on board, in a small archive designed to preserve human knowledge, were thousands of dehydrated tardigrades. The media went insane. Tardigrades on the moon! Earth's toughest creatures may have colonized the lunar surface. Life on the moon thanks to tardigrades. Did we accidentally contaminate the moon with indestructible life? except number. Those tardigrades are dead. Almost certainly. The crash was catastrophic. The spacecraft hit the moon at hundreds of meters per second. The impact would have generated temperatures hot enough to vaporize most materials. The G-forces alone would have been lethal to any biological material. And even if somehow, against all odds, some tardigrades survived the impact in ton form, they're stuck on the moon, in vacuum, in radiation. With temperature swings from minus 173 degrees Celsius at night to 127 degrees Celsius during the lunar day. With no water, forever. They can't wake up. They can't rehydrate. They can't reproduce. They can't do anything. They're just freeze-dried corpses sitting on lunar regolith, getting slowly degraded by cosmic radiation. Eventually, the radiation will damage their DNA beyond any possibility of recovery. Even if we somehow brought them back to Earth and rehydrated them decades from now, they'd be dead. But the headlines made it sound like we'd accidentally seeded the moon with life. Like tardigrades were going to wake up and start a lunar colony. We didn't. We littered the moon with dead microscopic animals, and this is the core of the lie. The internet has turned tardigrades into a symbol of invincibility, a mascot for resilience, a meme of toughness. But the reality is way more interesting than the meme. Tardigrades aren't indestructible. They're specialists. They evolved in environments that periodically dry out: moss, lichen, temporary ponds, soil that experiences seasonal droughts. In those environments, being able to shut down and wait for water is a massive advantage. Most animals die when their habitat dries up. Tardigrades just wait. So they evolved incredible desiccation tolerance. They produce special proteins called intrinsically disordered proteins that protect their cells during dehydration. They produce trehalose, a sugar that replaces water in their cells and prevents structural damage. They can repair DNA damage when they rehydrate. And as a side effect of that drought tolerance, they can survive other extreme conditions while dormant. But that's not what they evolved for. They didn't evolve to survive space. They didn't evolve to survive radiation. They didn't evolve to survive being boiled or frozen. They evolved to survive drought. Everything else is just a bonus. A side effect of the cellular protection mechanisms they developed for desiccation tolerance. And here's the kicker. They're not even the toughest organisms on Earth, not by a long shot. Certain bacteria, like Deinococcus radiodurans, can survive radiation doses far higher than tardigrades, up to 15,000 grays, 3 times what kills tardigrades. Certain fungi can survive longer periods of dormancy. Bacterial spores have been revived after millions of years. Some nematodes have comparable or even superior desiccation tolerance. Tardigrades are impressive, but they're not unique. They're just cuter and easier to meme, and that's why they became internet famous, while Deinococcus radiodurans, a bacterium that actually is nearly indestructible, remains unknown outside of microbiology departments. So why does this matter? Why does it matter if people exaggerate how tough tardigrades are? Because it distorts our understanding of biology. It creates this idea that life is either fragile or indestructible, with nothing in between. And that's not how life works. Life is adaptive, it's context-dependent. It's full of trade-offs. Tardigrades traded active resilience for dormant resilience. They can survive incredible extremes while shut down, but they're vulnerable while active. That's not a design flaw, that's an evolutionary strategy. And it's worked for 500 million years. But when we mythologize them as indestructible, we miss the actual lesson, which is that survival isn't about being tough. It's about being adaptable. Tardigrades don't survive space because they're strong. They survive it, barely, and only 12% of the time, because they can turn themselves off and wait. That's not toughness, that's patience. And maybe that's the real story we should be telling. Not that tardigrades are invincible, but that they've mastered the art of waiting out the bad times. They don't fight the environment. They don't resist it. They don't try to power through adversity with strength or speed. They just shut down, endure, and restart when conditions improve. And in a universe that's mostly hostile to life, that might be the smartest strategy there is. Because you can't be strong forever. You can't fight every battle. Sometimes the best move is to curl up, turn yourself off, and wait for things to get better. Tardigrades have been doing that for 500 million years, and they'll probably still be doing it long after we're gone. Not because they're indestructible, but because they know when to stop trying. If this changed how you see tardigrades, or made you realize that maybe we've been lying to ourselves about how tough they really are, leave a comment. Tell me what other internet myths about animals you want me to break down, because there are a lot of them, and most of them are just as wrong as this one. Subscribe if you want more videos that actually tell you the truth, instead of repeating the same exaggerated nonsense everyone else does. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.